South Africa's deteriorating infrastructure, crippled rail networks, dysfunctional ports, and an ongoing energy crisis cost its status as Africa's trade gateway. Analyst Jan Venter warns that unless urgent reforms are made, the country will continue to lag economically. Meanwhile, China is expanding its influence by investing in Africa's infrastructure, building ports and railways across the continent, including Kenya, Tanzania, and Namibia. While China's involvement raises concerns over debt and environmental impact, its proactive approach positions it as a dominant force in African trade and investment, filling the gap left by South Africa's decline. Now, we'll be talking more about this, and we have Clive Ramathibela-Smith, a senior executive partner at Hecare Capital and Partners, join me from Johannesburg to talk about this. Clive, it's nice to have you around.
Thanks very much, brother. It's nice to talk to you again.
Of course, yeah. So what is responsible for the deteriorating infrastructure weakening South Africa's position as the gateway to Africa's paradise?
I like the word you use there, paradise, you know. It's an incredibly sophisticated question, and one has to be very careful how you respond to it, because fundamentally, at the core of it is the failing proper management of our state-owned enterprises, none of which have been doing well, simply because of corruption, malfeasancy, and also just bad governance and management. So you can look at anything from the state fly carrier, which is the South African Airways, which was in Decay, just recently came back. You can look at Transnet, which is the responsible body that's supposed to be handling all things logistics in South Africa, including our ports. And you can see how corruption has eroded that particular institution and rendering it really insolvent. So there's a number of things I can go into. I don't think for this interview we have enough time, but it's critical just to mention that it has not been managed well.
So talk about mismanagement, corruption, so to speak, and you talked about government enterprises. Let's take, for instance, the railway system. I mean, we know that billions of rands have gone into government bailouts and interventions to strengthen Transnet's financial and operational capacity. Is it just because of corruption? Is it because of mismanagement that these government efforts are failing in these government institutions?
You know, my brother, maybe I must just take a bit back, maybe before you and I were born. South Africa was being run by an apartheid regime, which built these state-owned enterprises as a drive to create economic activity, to create jobs, and to make sure that we are sustainable. And actually, you remember, South Africa was banned from a number of trading partners. And so it had to be very creative and make things itself as the Afrikaans state to try and manage those things. So what happened was, these things were not made to be for profit. They were designed to be a way in which South Africa can trade much easier and create internal economic development for it to be sustainable. So when the new government took over, what happened was they wanted to hold on to these state-owned enterprises, not realizing that their operational structure is completely different from what we would call a standardized business or company. They were made there for development. They were made there not for profit, but instead for making sure that they are providing sustainability, economic activity, in creating jobs, and also making sure that the country is self-sufficient. However, what happened is, once the first or second administration had been done, they could not create capacity for these state-owned enterprises to be able to sustain themselves. For example, our electricity powerhouse, which is Eskom, completely missed the message to say you must be able to capacitate not just 6 million South Africans who are white. Now you have to do 46 million South Africans, which include the African black in that number. But they couldn't, because they didn't build enough infrastructure, they didn't build enough power stations to be able to power South Africa to 100%. Secondly, Transnet, who were responsible, previously known as Spoornet, who were responsible for our rail, did not create infrastructure development programs that would make sure that the rail infrastructure is steady, is modern. And even when they tried to do that, then the Guptas were involved. We got involved in corruption. And what happened, we ended up buying stationery and equipment that did not fit the standard that was supposed to be utilized on the railway infrastructure. How terrible is that? Billions upon billions of rands were wasted on buying locomotives that could not be utilized on South African railway network, which from the corridor, from the north to the south corridor, and I'm talking about your chrome, your coal infrastructure, all that has not been sustained. And that is why even today, they cannot fully capacitate providing the rail network that is required for us to be able to export as efficiently and as effective as we're supposed to. We are beaten by Maputo, which is our neighbor in Mozambique, in terms of capacity and being able to build. So it's very sad, it's unfortunate, but that's the state that we find ourselves in. And that is why when this article came through and I looked at the professor, I've spoken to the professor before, I've had interactions with him, and I know that he's been in some of these forums where we try and say, how do we save our ports? Just one more point to make. About 2 years ago, 2023, we had Transnet systems being hacked, and it completely and utterly, because of the manual structure that they have, it completely dismantled the operations. And not so long ago in 2021 as well, we had a terrible thing happen called the South African riots, where people went for grabs. And the first thing that they did was to attack the very same port, because it did not have enough security structures to be able to prevent such an event. So all these things, when you start to calculate the billions that have gone into waste, you can see why Transnet is in the pit hole.
So now you're tying this around poor managerial capacity and sustainability plan. I mean, we're talking about Transnet, Eskom, South Africa Airways. They're actually pride of South Africa at some point. So would they have sustained value in assets, revenue, and service delivery if they were wholly privatized?
Very interesting question, because remember, one of the reasons why we wouldn't want to privatize is to just make sure that we sustain things and we can create jobs, particularly for people of color in this country. I'm talking about the African black majority. However, what has happened is, because of privatization, because of the striving Johannesburg Securities Exchange listed companies, these state-owned enterprises have lost touch with reality, and the technology that they're using is of old. And so they haven't been able to create enough capacity and build on infrastructure based on the budget. By the way, I'm sure you heard, for the first time, our budget speech, the main speech that explains to us how our state enterprises are doing, the main speech that tells us what allocation of budget they're going to get, was postponed because now we are living in a government of national unity. So the ANC does not have the capacity anymore to make decisions on its own. So what that means is that things like privatization might be just the only way to get themselves out of this pit hole. Remember, privatization does not wait for government. So even in South Africa right now, as we speak, the biggest airline that's working currently, that's doing more trips, it's a private airline. It's called South African FlySafe Air. The biggest exporter who's doing rail at the moment is a private company called Musk. And if the biggest, even on things such as trucking and logistics, biggest companies there are private companies. So it is evident, even in power generation, people are now going for solar and people are going for other alternative energy resources because they can't rely on Eskom as an energy producer. So privatization will always happen. The best thing to do is to give it to the professionals so that they can be able, therefore, to resuscitate this dying infrastructure of the South African development government companies and make sure that they are sustainable. And those that they have sold, for example, the likes of Sasol are doing relatively well. The likes of Rectric and also a servicing company, they're doing well. we need to diversify. We need private sector. We need to realize that if we're going to compete with the rest of Africa, if we're going to be the gateway to Africa, we need to look like Hong Kong, have a crane on each and every side of our ports, make sure that we can be able to create the capacity, be efficient so that we can be able to be more reliable, and government and business will be able to work better together in that particular sense.
Okay, so amidst all of these that you said, Clive, Ramaphosa seems resolute on continuing with his reforms. Now, do you support and have faith in his economic plans to tackle the problems that you have actually mentioned here, right here on the show? I mean, these problems that bedeviling South Africa.
You know, the struggle with President Cyril Ramaphosa is that he's sitting in a government where he doesn't have control. He's got 10 other political parties that have to be considered, because that's how it's currently being studied over the last 8 months. And secondly, his biggest challenge is that in his own party, there's no much support for privatization, because they're in what's called a tripartite relationship with the likes of the SACP, which is the South African Communist Party, who believe in government owning everything and giving it to people so that they can sustain it. But it has completely and utterly failed. And that's the reality. And that's why the president has to look for a different direction. So what is it that is supposed to happen? We need to be looking at each and every state institution and see whether or not we are wasting taxpayers' money away, and in which way can we reinvent ourselves so that we can be more proactive, more efficient, and deliver better services to our people. When the government is working and when the companies are working, then we have efficiencies, which make it a very important, critical part of making sure that the economic development happens. Right now, I don't want to lie to you, my brother, it is very scary in South Africa. We have a battle with the United States, with President Donald Trump, who's just stopped all aid for the HIV and AIDS treatments to millions of South Africans. We have a trade war now with the United States, where things like AGOA, for example, are under tremendous amount of pressure. So South Africa is becoming a serious predicament to making Africa shine again. And therefore, they need to be decisive, because even though China can come up with the strategy or the way in which we can't rely on just one source of income. We need to be a multilateral, bilateral, or even as far as saying we've taken a stance to take both on. So we're saying that we want to be friends with both America and Russia at the same time. Unfortunately, it's a very difficult rope to walk.
Well, maybe South Africa can actually dwell on the fact that it's in the same association with China, that is the BRICS, to actually maybe solve all these problems. Maybe that can help in a way. Well, Clive Ramathibela-Smith, Senior Executive Partner at Hecare Capital Partners, thank you so much for your time on the show.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.